Hello everyone. So this is my latest journal that I made. It is vintage quilting with vintage buttons. It is 4 signatures and I will be listing her in my Etsy shop and on my Mercari. Little heart. Another heart. Okay. Vintage fabric. Some vintage lace, some trims. Vintage page out of a book. All these are vintage. Vintage piece of crochet with a vintage button. Vintage washi. Vintage music sheet. We have this vintage postcard wishing you a happy birthday. Vintage recipe. This is from a vintage book. Pears soap. And I just glued this on here. This die cut. A tag with some vintage lace on it. A butterfly. Fabric trim here. Vintage lace on this belly band. And this is a vintage doily. It's got texture to it. It's got some little flowers embossed on it. I made it into a little tuck spot for this cute little tag. Vintage fabric on the bottom. And this right here are from the buttons that I have on the side. Vintage buttons. Button card. Little cigarette card. Embossed tag. With this vintage ledger paper. Vintage book paper page. Piece of that quilting. Vintage lace on this vintage music sheet. An applique, vintage. From a vintage book. vintage lace at the bottom. And this is a cute collaged vintage snippet here of some fabric and laces. A vintage doily. I have a vintage playing card. And this right here, vintage lace trim. And I just have this gem clipped in. Vintage receipt. Vintage stationery page, and it's got like a swan on it, embossed swan. And can you see it? And this opens up. And I have this tucked into this pocket. And some vintage trim on this tag. You can journal on the back of the tags. And this is a little shaker that I made. A leaf stencil here on the side. Vintage lace pocket. This is vintage. Vintage. Die cut flower. Vintage book page. Vintage flower page for my flower book. This is textured. And this is a handmade tag. Some gorgeous fabric over it. Turn this into a tuck spot. Vintage fabric on this belly band. And some on the fabric on the tag here. A little belly band on the back. This large tag. And that is it. If you're interested in this journal, like I said, I will have her listed in my Etsy shop and on my Mercari shop. You just stop by and check it out. Thank you for watching.